Over 1 billion people use Windows today, and right now, millions of them are asking the same question: is there actually a way out? Because in the last 2 years, something shifted. Windows 11 started showing ads in the Start menu. It began forcing you to create a Microsoft account just to set up your own computer. It introduced Copilot, an AI assistant that analyzes everything you do, whether you asked for it or not. And then came the hardware requirements. Perfectly good computers declared obsolete overnight because they didn't have the right chip. For years, people tolerated Windows because the alternatives seemed complicated, risky, or incomplete. But in 2026, one name keeps coming up in forums, tech communities, and even mainstream tech advice: Linux Mint. It's free, it's private, and according to its supporters, it just works. But does it really? Can an operating system built by volunteers actually replace the most dominant desktop platform on Earth? That's what this investigation will prove. We're going to test the claims, expose the limitations, and give you the honest answer about whether Linux Mint can truly replace Windows in your life. Not in theory, not in some distant future, but right now, in 2026. Let's start with what Linux Mint actually is, because most people have never heard of it. Linux Mint is a free, open-source operating system based on Ubuntu, which itself is based on Debian Linux. It was first released in 2006, and the current version as of early 2026 is Linux Mint 22, codenamed Wilma. The Mint team describes it as an operating system designed to be elegant, modern, comfortable, and easy to use. Their stated goal is simple: provide a complete out-of-the-box experience that works for people who've never touched Linux before. You download it, install it, and theoretically, you're done. No command line required, no editing config files, no hunting down drivers for hours. That's the promise. From a technical standpoint, Mint comes with the Cinnamon desktop environment by default, which deliberately mimics the layout most Windows users already know. There's a taskbar at the bottom, a start menu in the corner, system tray icons on the right. It looks and feels like Windows 7 or 10, which is intentional. The Mint team knows their primary audience is people fleeing Windows, not Linux enthusiasts. The system comes preloaded with Firefox, LibreOffice, a media player, an image viewer, and a software manager that works like an app store. Everything you'd expect on day one is already there. And because it's based on Ubuntu, it has access to one of the largest software repositories in the Linux world. Thousands of applications, all free, all one click away. On paper, it sounds perfect. But here's what they don't tell you in the marketing material. When security researchers and longtime Linux users actually test whether Mint can replace Windows, they start with the hardest questions first. Not, can you browse the web? Obviously you can. The real test is compatibility. Can you run the professional software your job depends on? Can you play the games you actually play? Can you print to your printer, connect to your webcam, use your graphics tablet, sync your phone? Because if the answer to any of those is no, then Mint isn't a replacement. It's just a hobby. Let's start with professional software. Adobe Creative Suite does not run on Linux Mint. Photoshop, Illustrator, Premiere Pro, After Effects, none of them. Adobe has never released a Linux version and has shown zero interest in doing so. The workarounds people suggest, running Windows in a virtual machine, using wine compatibility layers, using web versions, are not replacements, they're compromises. The same is true for the Microsoft Office desktop suite. Yes, LibreOffice can open Word and Excel files, but if you work in an environment where document formatting matters, where you're collaborating with dozens of people using track changes, where you need advanced Excel macros or access databases, LibreOffice will break things, not sometimes, regularly. Then there's professional software in specific industries. Autodesk products like AutoCAD and Revit, Windows only. The full Affinity Suite, Windows and Mac. The Adobe alternatives people recommend, GIMP, Inkscape, Kdenlive, are impressive for free software, but they are not professional equivalents. If you're a graphic designer, video editor, architect, or engineer working in a professional environment, the software you need probably doesn't exist on Linux. And that's not Mint's fault, that's just reality. Now, let's talk about gaming, because this is where the narrative gets more complicated. Steam, the largest PC gaming platform, released Proton in 2018, a compatibility layer that lets thousands of Windows games run on Linux. And it works. As of 2026, over 15,000 games are verified or playable on Linux through Proton. Major titles like Elden Ring, Cyberpunk, 2077, and Baldur's Gate 3 run well. But here's what the gaming community actually reports. Performance is usually 5 to 15% worse than on Windows. Some games with anti-cheat software, especially competitive multiplayer games like Valorant, Apex Legends, and Call of Duty, simply will not run. Period. The anti-cheat sees Linux as a potential cheating environment and blocks it. If you only play single-player Steam games, you're probably fine. If you play anything else, you're taking a gamble. Then there's hardware. Most printers work fine on Linux Mint in 2026 because printer manufacturers finally started supporting open standards. Webcams generally work. Bluetooth usually works. But high-end hardware is a different story. NVIDIA graphics cards require proprietary drivers that occasionally break after system updates. Laptops with fingerprint readers or facial recognition often have those features disabled on Linux because manufacturers don't release Linux drivers. If you have a drawing tablet, a MIDI controller, a flight sim yoke, or any niche peripheral, you need to research compatibility before switching. Sometimes it works perfectly. Sometimes there's a community-built driver. Sometimes you're just out of luck. Here's the pattern interrupt you need to understand. Most people think Linux compatibility has gotten so good that everything just works now. That's not true. What's true is that basic computing works flawlessly. Web browsing, email, documents, media playback, casual photo editing, all of that is rock solid. But the moment you have one specific need, one professional application, one competitive game, one piece of hardware, you might hit a wall. And when you do, there's no customer support number to call. You're searching forums and hoping someone else solved your exact problem. But let's talk about what government regulators and institutions are actually saying, because there's a legitimate movement happening here. The city of Munich, Germany famously switched 15,000 computers to Linux in the mid-2000s, then switched back to Windows in 2017. Then recently announced they're evaluating a return to Linux again. Why? Because the total cost of ownership for Windows, licensing, forced upgrades, hardware replacement cycles has become unsustainable for public budgets. The French Gendarmerie, France's national police force, migrated 72,000 computers to Linux and has saved millions of euros. The Indian states of Kerala and Tamil Nadu have mandated Linux in schools and government offices. This isn't happening because Linux is more convenient. It's happening because of sovereignty and cost. Governments don't want to be dependent on a single American corporation for their critical infrastructure, and they don't want to pay licensing fees forever. But notice something. These are institutions with dedicated IT staff. They're not telling individual citizens to switch. They're making strategic decisions for managed environments. Privacy advocates and digital rights organizations, like the Electronic Frontier Foundation and the Free Software Foundation, have long promoted Linux as the privacy-respecting alternative to Windows. And they're not wrong. Linux Mint collects no telemetry by default. There are no ads, no forced cloud accounts, no AI assistant analyzing your files. But here's the nuance. Privacy doesn't pay your bills. If the software you need for work doesn't run on Mint, then privacy alone isn't enough to make the switch viable. Let's talk about real human impact with realistic scenarios. These aren't named individuals, but they represent actual categories of people trying to make this decision right now. Imagine a freelance writer who uses Google Docs, Spotify, and Firefox. They don't play games. They don't use Adobe. Their most demanding application is probably Zoom. For this person, Linux Mint is a perfect replacement. They could switch today, never look back, and probably have a faster, more stable system than they had on Windows. Their workflow doesn't change at all. Now consider a graphic designer working at a small agency. They're required to deliver files in Adobe formats. Clients send them InDesign packages. They use Photoshop daily. They could try running Windows in a virtual machine on Mint. But that means buying a Windows license anyway, dealing with performance overhead, and explaining to clients why files sometimes break. For this person, Mint isn't a replacement, it's a liability. Or think about a parent setting up a computer for their teenager. The kid needs it for school, Google Classroom, Microsoft Teams, typing essays, but they also want to play Fortnite and Roblox with friends. Fortnite doesn't run on Linux because of anti-cheat. Roblox technically can run through unofficial workarounds, but those break regularly. You could explain to a teenager why they can't play the same games as their friends because of your operating system philosophy? Or you could just install Windows. Here's a college student majoring in engineering. Their university requires AutoCAD for coursework. The lab computers have it, but they want to work from their dorm. AutoCAD doesn't run on Linux. The university isn't going to change their curriculum because one student prefers open source software. This student cannot use Mint as their primary system, no matter how much they might want to. The pattern here is clear. Linux Mint works brilliantly for people whose workflows are web-based, document-focused, or built around open source tools. It fails completely for people locked into proprietary ecosystems by professional requirements, education, or social gaming. And most people fall into the second category, even if they wish they didn't. So what has the Linux Mint team actually done to address these limitations? The answer is, they've focused on what they can control. Mint 22 includes better NVIDIA driver installation. They've improved the software manager to make finding applications easier. They've refined the update manager to be less intimidating for new users. They've partnered with TimeShift to include automatic system snapshots, so if an update breaks something, you can roll back. These are real improvements. But here's what's still broken, and it's not really Mint's fault. The Mint team cannot force Adobe to port their software. They cannot force game developers to disable anti-cheat on Linux. They cannot force hardware manufacturers to release Linux drivers. What they've built is an excellent operating system that is fundamentally limited by the ecosystem around it. And that ecosystem is controlled by corporations that have zero financial incentive to support a free operating system. Let's talk about security, because people assume Linux is automatically more secure than Windows. That's partially true. Linux Mint doesn't have the same malware target profile as Windows because it has a tiny market share. Attackers write malware for Windows because that's where the users are. But Mint also doesn't have the enterprise security infrastructure Microsoft has built. There's no automatic cloud backup, no ransomware protection, no enterprise endpoint management. For a home user, that's fine. For a business, that's a deal breaker. And here's a striking comparison. Windows has millions of dollars invested in user-facing security features like Windows Hello, BitLocker, and Windows Defender. Linux Mint's security model assumes you're competent enough to manage your own system. If you're not, you're more vulnerable on Mint than you'd be on Windows with default protections enabled. Your entire system is protected by whatever password you set during installation. If that password is weak, you're in trouble. If you don't encrypt your hard drive during setup, your data is sitting in plain text. So what can you actually do if you're considering this switch? First, don't switch blindly. Make a list of every application you use regularly. Not just the ones you think you use. Actually check. Then, research whether each one runs on Linux Mint. Search for the application name plus Linux Mint or Linux compatibility. If it's not explicitly supported, assume it won't work. Don't rely on probably or should work. Verify. Second, test Mint without risking your main system. Download the Linux Mint ISO file from linuxmint.com. Create a bootable USB drive using a tool like Rufus or Etcher. Boot from that USB and run Mint in live mode. This lets you test it without installing anything. Try your web browser, open some documents, connect to Wi-Fi, test your printer. See if it feels usable. If you like what you see, you can install it alongside Windows in a dual boot configuration. That means both operating systems live on your computer, and you choose which one to use when you start up. Third, if you're going to install Mint, enable disk encryption during installation. The installer will ask you about this. Say yes. Choose a strong password, write it down somewhere secure, and don't lose it. Also, enable TimeShift immediately after installation and create a system snapshot before you install any software. This gives you an undo button if something breaks. Fourth, go to the Update Manager and configure it to your comfort level. Mint gives you control over which updates to install. For most people, install all security updates immediately and be selective about kernel updates, which sometimes break hardware drivers. Fifth, spend time in the Software Manager. Search for alternatives to the Windows software you used. For Microsoft Office, try LibreOffice. For Photoshop, try GIMP. For Premiere, try Kdenlive. Understand that these are not perfect replacements, but they might be good enough for your needs. If you're a gamer, install Steam, enable Proton in the settings, and check protondb.com to see which of your games are verified to work. Don't assume they all will. This isn't a weekend project. This is a multi-week evaluation. If you rush it, you'll hit a wall, get frustrated, and go back to Windows. If you test properly, you'll know exactly what you're gaining and what you're giving up. Here's the truth in one sentence. Linux Mint can replace Windows completely for some people, partially for many people, and not at all for others. And which category you fall into has nothing to do with how tech-savvy you are. It has everything to do with what you need your computer to actually do. So here's your choice. Option 1. If you're even slightly curious, download Linux Mint, create a bootable USB, and test it this weekend. Don't install it, just try it. See if your world still works. Option 2. Share this video with someone who complains about Windows but doesn't know there are real alternatives. Help them make an informed decision. Leave a comment telling me which option you're choosing. I want to know who's actually testing this, because that creates accountability. Subscribe so you don't miss further investigations.